Welcome back, dear friends, to another journey here on Frame Shift. It feels good to be gathered again as fellow explorers of literature and film, as people who look for meaning not only in what a movie shows, but in what it whispers beneath the surface. Today, I want to talk with you about the Bourne Supremacy, 2004, a film that exists in that fascinating intersection where action collides with psychology, where espionage transforms into allegory, and where the chaos of car chases and shootouts somehow mirrors the inner turbulence of a man searching for himself. Before we begin, let me pause here and kindly ask, if you find joy in these kinds of deeper readings, in wandering into films as though they're text to be annotated and debated, please like this video and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps keep our community of readers and watchers alive. And just to clarify, what I'm sharing today is not a conventional review in the way most might expect. It's a critical, theoretical exploration intended especially for those with a literature background, those who crave to interpret and question rather than consume and move on. What always strikes me when I return to this story is not simply the pace or the adrenaline, though that is undeniable, but the way it lingers on memory, identity, and loss. Beneath the roar of engines and the crack of gunfire is a quieter story about the mind trying to stitch itself back together after being shattered by forces larger than itself. Watching it, I've often thought about times in my own life when memory seemed unreliable, when the person I was no longer matched the person I wanted to be. That uncanny dissonance between who we are and who we've been, between what others demand of us and what we demand of ourselves, resonates deeply here. It is an action thriller, yes, but it is also a meditation on the weight of guilt, the pull of past choices, and the possibility of transformation. On its surface, the film expands the tale of a man once trained to be a weapon, now hunted by the very hands that fashioned him. We meet him in uneasy exile, living in fragile peace, as though trying to convince himself that he is ordinary, that the nightmare has passed. Yet stories like his never rest. A shadow from the past claws its way forward, disguised as accident but deliberate in its cruelty, tearing apart the life he has tried to build. It is this wound, both personal and symbolic, that propels him back into the labyrinth. The narrative becomes not merely about survival, but about reckoning, as he discovers that the sins of institutions are stitched into his own skin. The pace is relentless. From the opening sequences, where stillness is shattered by violence, the story hurls us into a chase across continents. Each city feels like a chapter in a novel. Berlin with its cold austerity, Moscow with its haunted density, Naples with its labyrinthine alleys. And yet the settings are not simply places. They are reflections of his psyche, fragmented, restless, in perpetual motion. He cannot pause, cannot breathe, without the past surging up to consume him. It is here, in the rhythm of perpetual pursuit, that the story becomes allegory for trauma itself. How it follows, how it haunts, how it erupts when least expected. The plot unravels like a puzzle that is constantly rearranging itself. A mission gone wrong years ago reemerges, not only as mystery, but as accusation. The man who once believed he could sever himself from his training realizes that every step forward is tethered to what was buried. Enemies emerge not only in the form of assassins, but in the form of truth, files, names, memories clawing back. One of the most striking sequences involves him confronting the family of someone whose death was caused by his own hand during those lost years. There, the story sheds its genre skin and becomes literature, pure and painful, a meditation on responsibility, on whether forgiveness can ever be earned, on the human cost of machinery that manufactures killers. But of course, woven through this introspection is the pulse of action, the relentless chase that defines the saga. Car sequences crackle with realism, metal crunching, glass shattering, engines screaming not as fantasy, but as weight. Fights unfold not as ballet, but as desperate scrambles, every punch a question of survival. The camera shakes, not to confuse, but to immerse, to force us into the chaos of memory and violence colliding. Watching it, I often think about how form mirrors content, how the jitter of the lens reflects the fractured mind of its subject, how the chaos of editing embodies the instability of identity itself. And yet, what excites me most in recounting the narrative is not the spectacle, but the twists of revelation. We are teased with fragments of who he was, glimpses of training and missions that claw at him from within. Files emerge, operatives whisper, enemies circle, but the greatest enemy is his own past. The film teases us with possibility of resolution, of answers that might stitch him whole, but just when clarity seems near, another turn deepens the enigma. We realize alongside him that there may be no simple resolution, no clean truth, only the messy, haunting recognition of what has been done and what cannot be undone. By the time the story surges toward its finale, we are less concerned with who kills whom and more invested in who remembers, who forgives, who survives intact. There's a car chase in Moscow that feels less like action and more like nightmare. The man, bleeding and battered, driving through snow-laden streets with cops and killers at his heels, as though the city itself were trying to swallow him. Yet he pushes through, not for glory but for penance. The twists reveal that the past was darker than we imagined, that his role in it more complicit than he wanted to believe. And still, the conclusion does not abandon hope. It leaves us with possibility of redemption, fragile but real, the suggestion that a man can be more than his past if he dares to face it. That, for me, is why this story resonates beyond the thrills. Beneath its genre skin beats the heart of a tragedy tinged with hope, a tale about how memory binds and betrays us, about how we are shaped by choices even when we cannot remember making them. It teases us with answers, shocks us with revelations, and refuses to let us rest comfortably. Like literature, it leaves us questioning long after the credits fade, about guilt, about identity, about whether the past must define us. And in that sense, it is more than a thriller. It is allegory for the human struggle to reconcile who we were with who we might become. The story opens not with chaos, but with an attempt at calm, a fragile calm that we know, even as it is presented, cannot last. The man at the center of it all has chosen exile, retreating into the dusty stillness of Goa. The sea stretches endlessly, the sun filters lazily through the trees, and his days are spent trying to pretend that memory does not gnaw at him. He writes in journals, recording fragments of dreams that slip through his mind like ghosts. The storm that began in Goa now spreads across Europe, and we know it will not end quietly. The first half of the journey leaves us on edge, waiting for the collision of past and present, of guilt and revelation, of identity and redemption. And in that waiting, the story grips us, not because we crave spectacle, but because we crave understanding, because we want to know whether a man shaped into a weapon can ever reshape himself into something human. The second half begins with the air thickening, as though every frame is weighted with inevitability. The man who has been running, chasing, evading, finally seems to recognize that there is no outrunning what is inside him. The streets of Berlin blur behind him, but his mind is no longer focused only on escape. It is beginning to turn inward, to the fragments of memory that claw their way back with increasing ferocity. In these sequences, the film transforms from chase narrative in a psychological excavation, where every corridor he slips into and every shadow he avoids mirrors the labyrinth of his mind. As he crosses borders, the machinery of the intelligence agencies escalates in its hunt. Rooms lit by fluorescent light buzz with paranoia. Directors and analysts argue about containment, control, and culpability. For them, he is a problem to be solved, an equation to be neutralized. But what they do not realize is that his problem is no longer theirs. It is his own reckoning, his own need to piece together the mosaic of his past, regardless of how much it damns him. Watching these parallel threads, the bureaucracy scrambling on one side, his solitary pursuit on the other, always reminds me of how institutions and individuals interpret guilt differently. For institutions, guilt is liability, for the individual is a wound. The momentum drags him eastward into Moscow, the city that becomes crucible of his identity. Snow falls in sheets, muffling streets, cloaking alleys in silence. The Russian capital feels haunted, as though it has been waiting for him all along. Here, the plot tightens in a strangling grip. Operatives close in, cars slide across icy roads, bullets bite through cold air. And yet, the true battle is not fought with guns or engines. It is fought with memory. Flashes of a hotel room, a mission long ago, a woman's face, a man's voice, each fragment cuts deeper. The narrative here folds into itself, past bleeding into present until they are indistinguishable. One of the most harrowing sequences unfolds in Moscow streets, when a car chase barrels through snow-choked avenues. Engines roar, tires scream, metal crushes metal. The chase is not polished spectacle, but brutal, chaotic, claustrophobic. Windows shatter, cars slam against each other, bodies jolt with every impact. The camera shakes, fragments, pulls us inside the chaos. It feels less like action than nightmare, as though he is being driven not only by pursuit, but by memory itself, as though the city is trying to crush him into confession. When he finally stumbles from the wreck, battered and bleeding, it feels like symbolic rebirth, violence stripping him bare until nothing remains but truth. The truth he seeks lies not in agency files or whispered conspiracies, but in the faces of those who once bore the weight of his violence. He finds the family of a Russian politician, the man whose assassination years ago marked one of his darkest missions. The widow, cold and furious, does not flinch at his presence. In their apartment, time slows. He admits to what he has done, confessing not as weapon, but as man. This scene, to me, is the soul of the film. It strips away spectacle and confronts the question literature often asks. Can there be redemption without acknowledgement of guilt? He does not ask for forgiveness. He knows it is not his to claim. What he seeks is recognition, that he remembers, that he accepts responsibility, that he will no longer hide behind the excuse of lost memory. Meanwhile, across oceans, the machinery of power churns. The agency, cornered by exposure, begins to implode. Leaders who once barked orders now scramble to protect themselves, their words dripping with hypocrisy. Files are shredded, lies are spun, scapegoats prepared. Yet their collapse feels almost irrelevant beside his quiet confrontation in Moscow. Institutions dissolve into corruption, but individuals carry weight of truth. It is here that the story shifts definitively away from espionage thriller into moral parable. The system can destroy itself, but the man must face himself. As the second half unfolds, the tension builds not toward explosive finale, but toward quiet catharsis. Yes, there are chases, there are fights, but their energy is different now. They are not about survival. They are about inevitability. Each confrontation feels like ritual he must endure before arriving at moment of reckoning. Each opponent is less enemy than obstacle to the truth. The real climax is not duel of bullets, but duel with memory. When he finally delivers his confession and walks away into snow, we understand that resolution is incomplete. The agency still exists, enemies still breathe, lies still fester. Yet for him, there has been shift. He is no longer man defined by amnesia, no longer ghost of institutions making. He is man who remembers, who accepts, who refuses to be only what they made him. This, for me, is the brilliance of the second half. It leaves us not with comfort, but with complexity. Redemption is not clean. Truth is not healing, but acknowledgement is beginning. The film closes in quiet echoes rather than thunder. A phone call, a conversation, a suggestion that perhaps not all is lost. It is not victory, not absolution, but fragile step toward humanity. The story refuses to tie itself in neat bow. Instead, it lingers like scar, reminding us that identity is never fully resolved, that guilt never fully dissolves. And in that ambiguity, lies its literary strength. It ends not with closure, but with echo, forcing us to carry questions beyond the screen. For me, the second half resonates most in how it insists that spectacle must give way to reflection. The car chases thrill, the shootouts pulse, but the true climax is man facing family he has wronged, admitting aloud the weight of his sins. That scene, quiet and devastating, is worth more than any explosion. It is the kind of moment literature revels in, where action collapses into morality, where plot bends into allegory. By the end, we are left not exhilarated but contemplative. The story has been thrilling, yes, but it has also been sobering. It reminds us that violence echoes beyond its moment, that identity cannot be erased, that redemption, if it exists, must be earned through truth. The second half closes the loop not with triumph, but with gravity, and in that gravity, it secures its place not only as thriller, but as text worthy of analysis, discussion, and remembrance. Characters here are not merely players on a stage of espionage. They're fractured mirrors reflecting guilt, survival, ambition, and grief. To study them is to realize that this story's true terrain is not Europe or Moscow, but the human soul, riddled with contradictions and shadows. At the center stands the man himself, no longer the disoriented amnesiac of the first tale, but someone carrying fragments of self like shards of glass. He is haunted, sharper now, aware of his skills, but crushed by the knowledge that those skills exist because he was broken into weapon. In every glance, we see a paradox. Efficiency forged by trauma, gentleness shadowed by violence. He is not the heroic archetype of most thrillers, but a character in constant negotiation with his past. Watching him is unsettling because we recognize something universal. Our own regrets, our own memories we would rather bury, our own moments when survival demanded compromise. He is compelling precisely because he is both myth and man, assassin and penitent. The woman who anchors the beginning of his journey is not with us long, and yet her absence saturates the narrative. Her presence in the opening is soft rebellion against his past, her laughter and warmth reminders that he might have been something else, someone else. When she is taken from him, the film does not simply remove a character, it removes possibility. She becomes symbol of peace denied, of redemption delayed, of the ordinary life he cannot inhabit. Her ghost lingers, shaping his decisions, deepening his sorrow. She is less character than compass, pointing to what he might have been if history had allowed. The antagonist here is less a single figure and more the machinery of power, embodied in agency officials who scramble to cover lies and pin blame. Among them, one stands out, a director hardened by years of politics and paranoia. She does not foam with villainy. Her menace is quieter, bureaucratic, chilling in its pragmatism. She represents institution itself, the facelessness of systems that grind individuals into tools. Opposite the protagonist's humanity, she is ruthless efficiency, committed not to truth, but to survival of structure. Her character reminds us that institutions are not neutral. They're driven by people who choose expedience over conscience. Another figure emerges from shadows, the assassin sent to eliminate him, a mirror of who he once was. Cold, precise, remorseless, this killer embodies the path he might have taken had amnesia not cracked him open. Their encounters are not just battles of fists and guns. They're confrontations with self, with the terrifying possibility that he is no different from the man hunting him. Symbolically, the assassin is his double, the ghost of identity he struggles to escape. There is also the family of the murdered Russian politician, whose presence transforms narrative into morality play. The widow's grief, her bitterness, her refusal to flinch when he admits his crime. She represents accountability. She does not forgive, nor does she explode with melodrama. She simply exists as a reminder that every bullet has consequence, every mission leaves scar. Her daughter, silent and fragile, magnifies this truth. Violence reverberates through generations. These characters, though minor in screen time, are monumental in meaning. They force the protagonist to see himself not as pawn or victim, but as perpetrator. The intelligence analysts and field agents swirling around the core characters function almost like a Greek chorus. They argue in conference rooms, whisper over phones, chase through cities. Their perspectives remind us that while the protagonist struggles for identity, the machinery sees him only as problem. Their presence sharpens contrast. One man's search for truth against institutions' obsession with control. They are less individuals than extensions of bureaucracy, faceless yet dangerous. Moscow itself becomes character. Its snow-laden streets, its gray apartments, its silence heavy with history, all conspire to confront him. Cities in this story are not neutral settings, but embodiments of psyche. Berlin is fractured, bureaucratic, suspicious. Naples is labyrinthine, opportunistic. Moscow is frozen, suffocating, demanding reckoning. Each city reflects inner state of protagonist. Each street corner another turn and maze of memory. Symbolically, the characters divide along axes of humanity and institution, guilt and denial. The protagonist embodies fractured humanity, guilty yet yearning. The widow embodies grief, transmuted into accusation. The assassin embodies denial, remorselessness, the past unexamined. The agency officials embody faceless structure, truth buried under survival. Together, they form chorus of contradiction, each voice echoing different response to guilt. What fascinates me most is how relationships between characters define meaning. The protagonist and his lost companion represent possibility denied. The protagonist and the assassin represent self-divided. The protagonist and the widow represent guilt confronted. The protagonist and the agency represent man against institution. These dynamics transform action into allegory, ensuring that every chase, every confrontation, every confession carries weight beyond plot. In conclusion, the characters here are not mere archetypes. They are embodiments of themes. They remind us that identity is fragile, that institutions crush conscience, that violence leaves echoes, that guilt demands acknowledgement. They are literature disguised as thriller, allegory disguised as chase. And that is why they linger long after the credits fade, not as spies and killers, but as mirrors held up to our own fractured humanity. Every film leaves behind a trail of oddities, details tucked into production, quirks of casting, accidents on set, that illuminate not just how it was made, but why it feels the way it does. With this story, the strangeness lies not only in what happened behind the camera, but also in how those odd choices shaped the atmosphere that pulses through every frame. It is, after all, a thriller built as much on improvisation and experimentation as on tightly scripted precision. To catalog its strangest facts is to understand why it still feels unlike any other entry in its genre. One of the strangest elements is the director's approach to realism. Rather than choreographing fight scenes like ballets, he insisted they feel like collisions. Cameras were handheld, movements unsteady, lenses darting in and out of focus. Crew members joked they needed seasickness tablets after days of shooting. This was no accident. It was a deliberate attempt to mimic disorientation of trauma. At first, studio executives balked at style so jarring, worried it would alienate audiences. Yet it became signature, shaping an entire era of action cinema. What once looked like accident is now recognized as innovation. Casting quirks, also color production. The antagonist assassin, meant to mirror the protagonist's own dark past, was played by an actor known for subtlety rather than spectacle. He spoke barely a dozen lines, yet his presence dominated sequences. Strangely, the crew filmed multiple endings where his confrontation with protagonist played differently, some more brutal, others more ambiguous. Only in editing was final version chosen, leaving other possibilities discarded like ghost variations of story. These unseen endings haunt film's mythology, suggesting alternate fates that might have unfolded. Then there is the story of the Moscow car chase. Filmed across icy streets, It required months of preparation and permissions from local authorities. Yet even with planning, chaos ruled. Vehicles skidded unpredictably. Cameras froze in sub-zero temperatures. Stunt drivers whispered of near collisions that almost ended careers. One particularly harrowing crash was unplanned, but looked so authentic that director insisted it remain. The strangeness here lies in how danger blurred with performance. Cinema feeding off accidents to capture authenticity impossible to stage. Language barriers created their own oddities. Much of filming across Europe involved crews speaking different tongues, translators rushing between sets, instructions lost or distorted. In Berlin, one scene had to be res-hot entirely after miscommunication led to wrong set dressing. Yet these mishaps infused production with chaotic energy, mirroring story itself. A world where misinterpretation leads to disaster. Even props carried strangeness. The protagonist's journal, filled with scribbled dreams and fragmented memories, was not fake text, but written out in detail by the actor himself. He filled pages during downtime, scribbling fragments of phrases, sketches, half-formed sentences. Some of those pages never appeared on screen, but the act gave authenticity to performance. Crew members who later flipped through journal remarked it felt like holding artifact of real man's fractured psyche. That choice blurred line between acting and becoming. Another peculiar fact, the widow's apartment scene in Moscow was filmed in near silence, with minimal crew, almost like theater. The director wanted intimacy so raw it felt intrusive. Lights were dimmed, sound team reduced, camera stripped to bare essentials. The atmosphere unsettled cast and crew alike. Some described it as watching confession in real time, too heavy to be entertainment. That eerie stillness, born of production strangeness, translated into scene that still haunts viewers. Music, too, carried oddity. The score fused electronic pulses with mournful strings, creating soundscape both modern and elegiac. But stranger still, some tracks were improvised live during editing sessions, composers responding instinctively to footage, layering sounds in spontaneous bursts. The result was less composed and conjured, giving film sonic texture that feels improvised, unsettled, alive. One of the oddest behind-the-scenes moments involved filming in Goa. Locals, curious about Western production, crowded beaches during takes, sometimes wandering into frame. Crew had to negotiate with bystanders who refused to move, leading to shots filled with accidental extras. Rather than reshoot endlessly, director embraced authenticity. Figures remain in background, uncredited yet immortalized, ordinary people witnessing collapse of fictional piece. This accident only deepened sense of realism. Finally, consider the strangest fact of all, its reception. At release, critics were divided, some praising rawness, others condemning disorienting style. Yet over time, that very style came to define modern action cinema. What was once mocked as chaotic became template copied endlessly. The strangeness is that a film accused of breaking rules ended up rewriting them. Its rough edges, its quirks, its accidents became innovations that changed genre forever. Taken together, these facts form a mosaic of strangeness that mirrors story itself. Accidents became authenticity. Miscommunications became texture. Alternate endings became myths. Journals became artifacts. Real danger became spectacle. What should have been flaws became fingerprints. That is why the film endures. Not because it was perfect, but because it was strange, and in its strangeness it carved a new path. Critical perspectives on this story swirl like the smoke from its Moscow wreckage. Dense, divided, sometimes contradictory, but always revealing. It is a film that resists clean labels, and because of that, critics, scholars, and audiences alike have projected onto it their anxieties, their fascinations, their theories about identity, guilt, and the machinery of power. To explore these perspectives is to understand how a single thriller grew into a cultural text studied as literature as much as cinema. One of the most enduring perspectives is political. Many saw the narrative as allegory for post-Cold War paranoia and early 21st century disillusionment with power structures. Intelligence agencies here are not guardians but predators, their walls of glass and their rhetoric of security disguising corruption and scapegoating. The protagonist becomes symbolic of the individual crushed by state machinery, his fractured memory a metaphor for the way nations bury inconvenient truths. The events in Berlin, where bureaucrats scramble to cover tracks, were read as commentary on governments spinning lies to justify violence. In this light, the film is not merely thriller but critique, a mirror held to institutions that survive by erasing responsibility. From a psychological perspective, critics dwell on trauma as central text. Amnesia is not treated as gimmick but as allegory for disassociation. The way trauma fractures identity, the way guilt burrows into subconscious. Each chase scene becomes externalization of inner panic, each fragmented flashback a symptom of unresolved horror. Scholars noted how the handheld camera style, with its jitter and blur, mimics the instability of trauma. The events in Moscow, particularly the confession to the widow, were hailed as cinematic portrayal of survivors' guilt, raw, unflinching, unwilling to indulge catharsis. This reading elevates the film beyond genre, situating it within literature of trauma and memory. Feminist critics, meanwhile, turn their gaze to women in the narrative. The companion, lost early, represents fragility of ordinary life denied to men forged into weapons. Her presence, though brief, lingers as ghost of possibility. The agency director embodies another archetype, woman navigating male-dominated institution, wielding power with cold precision. Some critics read her as subversion, female authority figure as ruthless as her male counterparts. Others condemned her role as perpetuation of stereotype, woman cast as bureaucratic villain rather than fully rounded character. The widow in Moscow complicates this further. She is neither victim nor vengeful fury, but calm embodiment of accountability. Feminist readings fracture around these roles, debating whether the film empowers or diminishes, whether women are catalysts of meaning or props for male guilt. From a postmodern lens, the film is praised for its fragmentation. Narrative structure, editing style, and cinematography all refuse coherence. Truth is partial, memory incomplete, meaning unstable. Critics argue that this mirrors postmodern skepticism. There is no single truth, only perspectives layered, distorted, contested. The events in Berlin and Naples become not just plot, but commentary on how surveillance, files, and records construct reality. The protagonist's fractured memory mirrors society's fractured narratives, each claiming authority, yet none absolute. Another stream of criticism focuses on genre. Traditional thrillers often glorify espionage, presenting spies as glamorous, efficient, in control. This story rejects that fantasy. It presents espionage as machinery of guilt, operatives as expendable, institutions as morally bankrupt. Action sequences, rather than stylized, are brutal, claustrophobic, messy. Critics hailed this as redefinition of action genre, stripping glamour to reveal exhaustion. The car chase in Moscow, messy and chaotic, was singled out as anti-Bond moment. Thriller realism where survival trumps spectacle. Reception at time of release reflected these critical fractures. Some audiences complained of nausea from handheld camera work, condemning style as distraction. Others hailed it as innovation, praising immersion and authenticity. Critics debated endlessly whether disorienting form elevated or degraded narrative. What few disagreed on, however, was that the film shifted action cinema permanently, spawning imitators across Hollywood. Its events became benchmarks: the Goa tragedy, the Berlin Exchange, the Moscow Confession. Each scene sparked essays, conversations, arguments about what thrillers could be. Academics later placed it within tradition of existential cinema. The protagonist, stripped of memory and haunted by guilt, embodies Sartrean anti-hero, condemned to freedom, forced to choose identity even when choices are poisoned. His confrontation with the widow is read as a moment of radical authenticity. He accepts his past, refuses self-deception, embraces weight of responsibility. In this light, the film transcends thriller to stand as philosophical parable, echoing themes of Camus and Kafka. Events themselves became cultural flashpoints. The Goa tragedy shocked audiences, subverting expectation that companion characters are safe anchors. Critics argued this moment redefined stakes, turning narrative from escapism into grief. The Berlin operation exposed hypocrisy of institutions, igniting debates about political allegory. The Moscow chase was dissected as technical masterpiece, but its meaning, survival at cost of body and soul, drew equal attention. And the confession in apartment became centerpiece of scholarly discussion, studied in film schools as rare moment where action cinema pauses to meditate on guilt. The strangest critical perspective, perhaps, is how the film was retroactively viewed as prophecy. An era where whistleblowers exposed surveillance states, scholars pointed back to it as cinematic anticipation of global paranoia. Its events, once dismissed as paranoia, came to feel eerily prescient. Thus, it shifted again from entertainment to cultural artifact, studied for its resonance with political reality. In some, critical perspectives and events form mosaic as fractured as protagonist memory. Political allegory, psychological trauma, feminist debate, postmodern fragmentation, genre redefinition, existential philosophy, all converge. No single perspective dominates, because film itself resists coherence. It is not puzzle to be solved, but storm to be endured. Its events remain haunting because they refuse closure, demanding we read them not as answers, but as questions. Behind the curtain of this story lies another narrative, one not of spies and assassins, but of filmmakers wrestling chaos into coherence. The production of this film, much like its protagonist's fractured journey, was defined by improvisation, accidents, and decisions that broke convention. To understand how it was made is to see how its rawness was not accident, but deliberate philosophy, forged through choices that often felt reckless in the moment, but left fingerprints on cinema that endure to this day. The first and perhaps strangest insight is how little was scripted in stone. The director, stepping into the saga for the first time, rejected polished choreography in favor of mess. Fight scenes were not planned frame by frame. Instead, actors were trained in techniques, then thrown into brawls where cameras darted around them like observers. This created footage that felt chaotic, jagged, often unusable. Editors spent months stitching fragments together, creating rhythm from collision. The result was style that divided audiences. Some condemned it as disorienting, others hailed it as revolutionary. What critics called shaky cam was behind the scenes, a gamble on realism over clarity. The Goa sequences illustrate production's oddities. Shot on location, they were meant to capture warmth of exile, the illusion of peace. Yet filming proved exhausting. Heat and humidity warped equipment, and curious crowds of locals often wandered into frame. Rather than fight chaos, the crew embraced it. Many background figures in market scenes are real bystanders, uncoached, adding authenticity to supposed sanctuary. Ironically, the very environment meant to represent stillness was filmed in conditions of noise, distraction, and improvisation. The tragedy that strikes in Goa was shot under intense secrecy. Scripts distributed to crew omitted the twist, and even extras were kept unaware. When the scene was finally staged, the actress herself insisted on shooting multiple takes in brutal conditions, demanding her exit feel abrupt yet devastating. Behind the camera, silence fell as cast and crew recognized gravity of the moment. For many, it was most difficult scene of production, not because of logistics, but because it required severing heart of story. Berlin offered its own challenges. Permissions to film in iconic locations were hard-won, requiring negotiations with officials wary of disrupting daily life. Some chase sequences were filmed guerrilla style, cameras hidden, actors moving through real crowds unaware they were part of set. This approach risked chaos but yielded authenticity, shocked reactions, genuine confusion, real urban energy. In editing room, these fragments lent city an air of paranoia, impossible to stage artificially. The Moscow car chase is legendary in production lore. Shot over weeks in freezing conditions, it tested endurance of cast, stunt drivers, and crew. Ice made roads unpredictable. Cars skidded uncontrollably. Cameras froze in cold. One major crash was unplanned, a vehicle colliding harder than rehearsed, sending debris flying. No one was seriously injured, but director insisted footage remain. It looked too authentic to discard. This philosophy, embracing accidents as art, ran through entire production. The chaos on screen was chaos lived. Props carried their own strangeness. The protagonist's journals were not filled with random scribbles, but with text written by actor himself. During downtime, he scrawled fragments of dreams, sketches, half-thoughts, creating artifact that reflected fractured psyche. Crew members flipping through pages later remarked it felt eerie, as if glimpsing real man unraveling. The journals never appear fully in film, but their presence shaped performance, grounding abstraction in tangible detail. The Moscow apartment confession was filmed under conditions resembling theater. Crew reduced to minimum, lights softened, cameras stripped to essentials. The director demanded silence, creating atmosphere so intimate it unsettled cast. Some crew later described it as witnessing something private, not performing something public. That intimacy translated into scene many regard as emotional climax of the film, one born less of spectacle than of restraint. Music production offered its own quirks. The composer layered mournful strings with electronic pulses, recording in dimly lit studio to mimic atmosphere of secrecy. In some sessions, footage played silently on walls while musicians improvised, letting images dictate sound. These spontaneous compositions, later edited, lent score its haunted texture. The strangeness here is how much of music was discovered rather than written, improvised in same spirit as fights and chases. Even marketing leaned into oddity. Trailers avoided traditional exposition, focusing instead on fragments, flashes of faces, crashes of cars, beats of drums. Executives worried audiences would be alienated by lack of clarity, but gamble paid off. The fragments mirrored protagonists' fractured memory, turning marketing itself into narrative device. On set, camaraderie grew from hardship. Long hours, cold nights, endless retakes forged solidarity. Actors joked about bruises, crew laughed at unpredictability of directors' choices, editors cursed endless reels of shaky footage. Yet all admitted later that chaos felt purposeful, as though they were less filming movie than surviving campaign. This shared ordeal became mythology of its own, echoing struggles of characters they portrayed. What fascinates most about production is how it mirrored themes of story. Just as protagonists stumbled through fragments of memory, filmmakers stumbled through fragments of footage. Just as he endured chaos to find meaning, they endured chaos to find rhythm. The film's rawness is not accident, but reflection. Production became allegory for narrative, behind-the-scenes reality bleeding into cinematic fiction. In retrospect, fun facts of production feel less trivial than emblematic. Goa's chaos, Berlin's guerrilla shooting, Moscow's dangerous chases, improvised journals, intimate apartment scene, all contributed to film's haunting texture. Its strangeness, its rough edges, became fingerprints that distinguished it from polished thrillers. And perhaps that is why it endures. Not because it was flawless, but because it was flawed in ways that mattered. Flaws that became style, accidents that became poetry. Behind-the-scenes story is not of perfection achieved, but of imperfection embraced. Chaos endured until it became art. Settings in this story are not inert landscapes. They're characters, each carrying weight, mood, and allegory. To understand a film is to see how every city, every room, Every fragment of environment reflects not only external conflict, but the internal storm of a man grappling with identity and guilt. Cinematic elements, camera, light, sound, rhythm, conspire with these settings to transform the world into a mirror of his fractured psyche. Goa opens the story with deceptive warmth. Its beaches glow under sunlight, its markets hum with color, its homes radiate the texture of ordinary life. Yet the calm feels fragile, as though waves whisper warning. This setting is not sanctuary but illusion, a dreamscape that cannot hold. When violence pierces it, the rupture is more devastating because of contrast, paradise shattered into nightmare. Goa becomes symbol of possibility denied, a place that might have been future but is stolen by past. Berlin offers opposite atmosphere. Cold, gray, clinical, its streets and offices embody bureaucracy and suspicion. Government buildings of glass and steel glisten with sterility, their transparency paradoxically hiding truth. Every frame in Berlin feels surveilled, as though city itself is watching. The alleys are narrow, the skies overcast, the mood oppressive. Here, the protagonist moves like ghost through labyrinth, hunted not only by enemies but by architecture itself. Berlin becomes embodiment of institution, efficient, paranoid, inhuman. Naples is brief but labyrinthine. Its alleys twist unpredictably. Its markets bustle with deceptive normality. Cinematically, it is shot with disorientation, the camera weaving through crowds, light flickering unpredictably. Naples represents surveillance turned against itself, where he is cornered yet escapes by exploiting chaos. Symbolically, it is a place where machinery falters, where system reveals its fragility. Moscow dominates the second half, and its setting becomes crucible. Snow blankets streets, muffling sound, cloaking city in silence. Buildings loom heavy with history, their facades scarred by time. Interiors are cramped, dim, oppressive. Cinematography emphasizes cold blues and grays, colors that seep into bone. In Moscow, every breath is visible, every movement burdened by frost. The city itself feels complicit in pursuit, suffocating and relentless. Yet within this coldness lies truth. The confession scene in cramped apartment becomes heart of film, made heavier by oppressive setting. Moscow is not just backdrop. It is embodiment of reckoning. Smaller settings add layers. The widow's apartment, dimly lit and claustrophobic, symbolizes accountability. It strips grandeur, forcing intimacy, demanding confrontation. The agency's control rooms, glowing with screens and harsh light, embody surveillance as religion, every surface reflecting paranoia. Cars themselves become mobile settings, claustrophobic chambers of violence, their interiors shaking, shattering, collapsing around bodies. Cinematography stitches these settings into allegory. Handheld cameras refuse stability, mimicking protagonists' fractured memory. Frames blur, jolt, crash into each other, reflecting trauma's instability. Critics once mocked this disorientation, but symbolically it places us inside his psyche. We do not watch chaos, we inhabit it. Lighting reinforces this. Goa glows warm until ripped apart. Berlin glares sterile. Moscow freezes blue. Colors function as emotional cartography. Sound design anchors mood. Waves in Goa crash softly, then fall silent after tragedy. Berlin hums with mechanical echoes. Phones, computers, trains, industrial paranoia rendered sonic. Moscow groans with engines, crashes, silence thick as snowfall. The car chase, especially, immerses us in metal grinding, glass shattering, snow crunching. Silence in apartment confession is equally powerful, absence of sound amplifying weight of guilt. Editing reinforces instability. Flashbacks erupt unpredictably, memory fragments slicing into present. Scenes cut abruptly, denying comfort of smooth transitions. Chases are stitched in jagged rhythm, each cut disorienting. Editing is not invisible craft, but rhetorical device, forcing audience to feel fractured time as protagonist does. Mise-en-scene ensures every environment functions symbolically. Goa's clutter markets embody life lived, Berlin's glass walls embody lies disguised as transparency. Moscow's bleak apartments embody history's scars. Even clothing contributes. Thick coats in snow, sleek suits in boardrooms, ordinary jackets clinging to man, trying to remain invisible. Each detail reinforces allegory of humanity versus institution, guilt versus denial. Symbolically, settings chart journey from illusion, Goa, to oppression, Berlin, to reckoning, Moscow. They function like stages in descent. Dream, labyrinth, crucible. Each step strips away denial, forcing confrontation. Cinematic elements, camera instability, lighting contrasts, soundscapes, editing ruptures, work as chorus, underscoring meaning. What makes these settings remarkable is their refusal of neutrality. No city is just city, no room just room. Each embodies theme, each insists on meaning. We leave film not with sense of geography, but with memory of atmospheres. Sunlight broken, glass reflecting lies, snow swallowing truth. That is why settings and cinematic elements matter here. They transform story from thriller into literature. They remind us that place is never passive, that film is language of space as much as dialogue. In this story, the world itself speaks, and what it says is as haunting as the bullets and confessions that drive the plot. Behind the curtain of this film lies another tale, one that mirrors the chaos, fragility, and improvisation of the narrative itself. The making of it was not smooth orchestration, but battle of its own, fought between ambition and limitation, vision and practicality. If the protagonist staggers through a world that seems intent on crushing him, the filmmakers endured a process just as relentless, shaping turbulence into art. To look at the behind-the-scenes story is to see how much of what feels accidental on screen was, in fact, born of accident in reality. The director entered production with mission as radical as the protagonist's own, stripped the action genre of its glossy polish. He rejected the clean choreography of Hollywood fights, the balletic stunts perfected in rehearsal rooms. Instead, he wanted rawness, scenes that felt caught rather than staged. Cameras would be handheld, restless, close to skin. Editors would not polish continuity, but fracture it, echoing memory's instability. This decision terrified executives, who feared audiences would recoil from disorientation. Yet the director persisted, convinced that only through chaos could authenticity emerge. On set, he often told crew, "If it feels messy, we're close." Goa was the first crucible. Shot on location, its beaches and markets were alive with locals who often wandered uninvited into frame. Rather than clear crowds, the crew embraced them. Many faces seen in opening sequences are not extras, but real bystanders, their curiosity adding texture. Filming was grueling. Heat-warped lenses, humidity-fried electronics, sweat poured from crew. And yet, this imperfect environment lent scenes warmth that felt lived in. The tragedy staged there, tearing apart fragile peace, was filmed under conditions of secrecy. Scripts given to background crew omitted details, preserving shock even for those behind camera. When final take was captured, silence hung heavy. Cast and crew felt as though they had executed real severing of possibility, not just narrative beat. Berlin was another battlefield. Permission to shoot in iconic locations was limited, so guerrilla techniques became norm. Actors slipped into real streets, pursued by handheld cameras, blending with actual pedestrians who had no idea they were part of film. Some startled reactions captured on screen were genuine, not rehearsed. This approach produced logistical nightmares, scenes interrupted by traffic, sound drowned by city life, but also authenticity impossible to fake. For crew, it was chaos. For film, it was gold. The Moscow car chase became legend of production. Weeks of filming in sub-zero temperatures tested every member. Stunt drivers fought treacherous roads glazed with ice. Vehicles skidded unpredictably, and cameras froze mid-take. One crash, harsher than planned, sent debris scattering dangerously close to crew. Miraculously, no one was harmed, and director insisted footage remain. What looks like reckless survival on screen was reckless survival in reality. Cast endured bruises, stunt teams muttered about quitting, but images captured were too powerful to abandon. By the end, many admitted Chase felt less filmed than survived. Props carried their own stories. The protagonist journals, seen briefly on screen, were not filled with gibberish but written by actor himself. He scribbled during downtime, dream fragments, half-formed sentences, sketches, immersing himself in characters' fractured psyche. These pages were never meant for audience's eye, but crew flipping through them later described sensation of holding artifact, as though character had left trace of existence. This method blurred line between performance and embodiment, enriching portrayal with unseen depth. The confession scene in Moscow apartment was filmed in atmosphere of near-sacred intimacy. Crew was stripped to minimum, lights dimmed, cameras hushed. Director demanded silence, so profound that even whispers felt intrusive. The widow's restrained grief and protagonist's weary remorse unfolded, as though not acted but lived. Some crew described watching with lump in throat, forgetting they were filming. The heaviness of that moment lingers in final cut, rawness born of respect for silence. Editing room became another battlefield. Hours of footage shook with instability, blurred frames, jolting movements, continuity gaps. Editors struggled, some despairing that film was incoherent. Yet, director pressed them to lean into disorientation, not correct it. Cuts became jagged, rhythm fractured, memory itself echoed in style. This choice birthed aesthetic that redefined action cinema, though at times it felt like gamble that might ruin project. Music sessions mirrored improvisational spirit. Composer blended mournful strings with electronic pulses, often improvising live while footage played silently. He wanted sound to feel haunted, unsettled, as though echo of memory itself. Some tracks emerged from accidents, feedback loops, distorted recordings, mistakes embraced rather than discarded. The score, like film, was less composed than discovered, stitched from fragments until it pulsed with uneasy life. On set, camaraderie was forged through hardship. Long nights, cold winds, endless takes bonded cast and crew. They joked about bruises, cursed unpredictable weather, laughed at absurdity of chasing perfection through chaos. Gallows humor reigned, mirroring tone of story itself. Dark, weary, but resilient. Behind the exhaustion, though, was conviction that they were crafting something different, something raw. When production wrapped, no one was sure what they had. Executives worried audiences would reject style, critics would condemn messiness. Yet when film premiered, it startled industry. Some viewers indeed recoiled, calling it incoherent. But others hailed it as revelation, praising authenticity, intensity, new grammar of action. What once seemed flaw became innovation. The gamble paid off, not through polish, but through refusal of polish. Looking back, behind the scenes, story mirrors narrative itself. Just as protagonist staggers through fragments of memory, filmmakers staggered through fragments of footage. Just as he survives chaos to reclaim self, they survive chaos to create film. Its imperfections, its accidents, its bruises became essence of style. The production was not smooth march, but war of attrition. And like character at its center, it endured, not because it was flawless, but because it refused to collapse. That is why behind-the-scenes insights matter here. They reveal that what feels unstable on screen was born from instability lived. The film's aesthetic is not trick, it is scar. And scars, as we know, tell stories as haunting as any script. Filmmaking here feels like insurgency, an intentional break from glossy tradition, a rebellion against choreography too polished, a manifesto written with shaky cameras and fractured edits. To watch it is to sense not only narrative of hunted man, but philosophy of cinema itself, reshaping how thrillers could be shot, cut, and felt. The box office response. both surprising and divisive, became proof that audiences were willing to endure disorientation if it meant authenticity. The camera was first weapon. Gone were the wide, steady frames of spy fantasies. In their place came handheld lenses jittering like nerves. In fights, the lens stayed close, sometimes too close, capturing fists as blurs, breaths as gasps, walls as weapons. Critics coined term shaky cam, dismissing it as incoherent. Yet for director, this instability was essential. It put viewers inside protagonists' fractured perception. Violence was not spectacle, but claustrophobia, not choreography, but survival. Every jolt of frame symbolized trauma's disorientation. Editing became second weapon. Cuts were jagged, transitions abrupt, rhythms fractured. Chases unfolded as flurries of glimpses, crowds parting, doors slamming, tires skidding. Memory fragments invaded present, stitched into narrative with little warning. The effect was unsettling but deliberate. Editors described process as composing music, long silences punctuated by bursts of percussion. The result was rhythm of trauma itself. Unpredictable, fragmented, never stable. Sound design anchored chaos. Gunshots cracked with deafening immediacy, louder than expected, leaving ringing in ears. Engines roared not as sleek machines, but as beasts grinding metal. Fists connected with visceral thuds. Bodies crashed into furniture. Glass shattered like bones. Silence was wielded with equal force. Entire sequences stripped of score, leaving only breath and heartbeat. In confession scene, sound fell away completely, amplifying weight of words. This minimalism gave violence greater impact, silence greater gravity. Lighting sculpted mood. Goa glowed with warmth, sunlight, earth tones, dream of peace. Berlin shimmered with sterile fluorescence and cold gray skies, light reflecting paranoia. Moscow was drenched in blue, snow reflecting pale glow, interiors dim with history's weight. Lighting here was rhetoric, not realism. Warm for illusion, gray for bureaucracy, blue for reckoning. Every hue told story, every shadow spoke of theme. Performance style added depth to techniques. The lead actor embodied exhaustion as much as skill, his every glance shadowed by guilt. He avoided theatrics, grounding character in weariness. The agency director performed ruthlessness not with rage, but with restraint. Her calm made her menace sharper. The widow performed grief through stillness, refusing melodrama. These performances aligned with filmmaking philosophy. Understatement as power, restraint as revelation. Mise en scene reinforced allegory. Glass offices reflected lies disguised as transparency. Journals filled with scribbles embodied fractured psyche. Cars became coffins on wheels, their cramped interiors settings of violence. Props were not decoration, but symbols. Even clothing played role. Thick coats weighed characters down in Moscow, emphasizing burden of truth. Box office performance revealed audiences' willingness to embrace risk. Despite worries about disorienting style, film grossed more than predecessor, proving appetite for rawness. Internationally, it resonated strongly, its themes of surveillance and mistrust striking chord in climate of geopolitical paranoia. Critics were divided, some lauded innovation, others derided chaos. But conversation itself ensured cultural impact. Few films redefined grammar of genre. This one did. Awards recognition was modest, yet influence was vast. Its techniques reshaped action cinema, copied endlessly in years that followed. The shaky cam aesthetic, once derided, became norm. Subsequent thrillers, even outside franchise, adopted fractured editing, close-quarters fights, documentary-like immediacy. Its box office success confirmed what studios had not believed. Audiences craved immersion over clarity, chaos over choreography. Behind this reception lies irony. What began as gamble became template. Directors' insistence on mess, editors' embrace of fragmentation, actors' commitment to restraint, all risked alienating viewers. Instead, it created intimacy with chaos, authenticity that lingered. Box office returns validated philosophy, proving that imperfection could be innovation. Symbolically, filmmaking techniques mirrored themes. Shaky camera mirrored fractured memory. Jagged editing mirrored instability of identity. Sound design's silences mirrored weight of guilt. Lighting's palettes mirrored emotional landscapes. Performance restraint mirrored exhaustion of survival. Mise en scene mirrored allegory of institutions and trauma. Style was not surface, but substance. In retrospect, box office triumph feels like rebellion rewarded. A film that broke rules of clarity, continuity, spectacle became cultural landmark, proving audiences willing to endure storm for truth. Its success was less about spectacle than about resonance. Viewers felt disorientation, guilt, exhaustion, and recognized humanity inside action. Thus, filmmaking techniques and box office story form one truth. This was not just movie, but manifesto. It demanded that thrillers stop polishing and start scarring. It proved scars sell, scars move, scars endure. And in those scars, cinema itself was rewritten. Conclusions in most thrillers deliver resolution, closure, the clean satisfaction of plot tied neatly together. But this story refuses that comfort. Its conclusion lingers not as triumph, but as echo, not as catharsis, but as scar. To leave it behind is to carry questions heavier than answers. Questions about guilt, memory, identity, and what redemption might look like for someone who has spent his life as both weapon and penitent. The man at its center does not end in victory. He does not topple the agency that created him, nor does he cleanse himself of blood. Instead, he survives, limping into snow, battered yet breathing. Survival here is not triumph, but burden. His endurance means his guilt continues, his memory sharpens, his responsibility deepens. Symbolically, this conclusion insists that survival itself can be punishment, that life is not always gift, but continuation of reckoning. He becomes emblem of endurance rather than heroism, figure defined not by conquest, but by refusal to collapse. The widow in Moscow embodies another thread of conclusion. Her grief remains untouched, her pain unsoftened. His confession to her does not undo death of husband, nor does it grant her relief. What it offers is acknowledgement that the man responsible remembers, that he refuses to hide behind amnesia, that he accepts culpability. In her silence, we sense refusal to forgive, but also recognition that truth has been spoken. Symbolically, she embodies audience itself, forced to confront that violence echoes beyond spectacle, that stories of spies are not escapist fantasies, but allegories of wounds that ripple through generations. The agency's machinery continues, unbroken. Bureaucrats shuffle papers, excuses are made, blame is shifted. Glass walls still gleam, phones still buzz, paranoia still hums. This is perhaps the most chilling aspect of conclusion. The institution survives, indifferent to confessions or chases. It does not end because it cannot. Systems of power adapt, regenerate, persist. Symbolically, conclusion delivers critique sharper than any explosion. Individuals may confess, bleed, remember, but institutions endure by burying truth beneath bureaucracy. Yet within this bleakness, there is flicker of humanity. In final scenes, a phone call bridges continents, voices speak across divide, and for a moment, there is possibility, not of forgiveness, but of connection. That call is less about plot than about hope, fragile and tentative. It suggests that while institutions persist and guilt endures, human beings can still reach out, still acknowledge, still attempt to heal. Symbolically, it is fragile redemption, not sweeping, not clean, but real in its modesty. For audiences, conclusion provokes paradox. On one hand, it frustrates traditional hunger for resolution. No villain is neatly vanquished, no institution toppled, no hero purified. On the other, it resonates more deeply because it mirrors reality, Where guilt lingers, institutions persist, and redemption is never absolute. Viewers leave unsettled, haunted, yet oddly satisfied, because story has honored complexity rather than simplifying it. Critical voices praise this refusal of closure. Scholars argued that conclusion transforms film from genre piece into allegory. It becomes parable about human struggle with memory and guilt, insisting that truth is not resolution but confrontation. Others condemned it for denying catharsis, calling it bleak. Yet this debate itself is testament to its power. Forgettable films end quietly. Haunting ones provoke argument. Thematically, conclusion crystallizes everything. Identity remains fractured, but protagonist chooses to carry it rather than deny it. Memory remains painful, but confession proves it cannot be buried. Guilt remains unresolved, but acknowledgement makes it bearable. Institutions remain corrupt, but individuals can still choose honesty. Symbolically, every theme converges into echo: survival, confession, persistence, fragility. For me, conclusion resonates most because it feels like literature, not cinema. It refuses genre conventions, insisting instead on ambiguity. It is not about tying threads, but about leaving audience in storm, asking them to wrestle with guilt, memory, responsibility. It dares us to see thriller as allegory, to read car chases and gunfights as metaphors for trauma and confession. In its refusal to give closure, it gives meaning. That is why it endures beyond entertainment. Its conclusion is not explosion but echo, not victory but survival, not absolution but acknowledgement. It tells us that redemption, if it exists, lies not in erasing past, but in remembering it, not in triumph, but in endurance. It insists that scars remain, that stories linger, that truths spoken matter, even when they do not heal. The film closes in quiet echoes rather than thunder. A phone call, a conversation, a suggestion that perhaps not all is lost. It is not victory, not absolution, but fragile step toward humanity. The story refuses to tie itself in neat bow. Instead, it lingers like scar, reminding us that identity is never fully resolved, that guilt never fully dissolves. And in that ambiguity lies its literary strength. It ends not with closure, but with echo, forcing us to carry questions beyond the screen. For me, the second half resonates most in how it insists that spectacle must give way to reflection. The car chases thrill, the shootouts pulse, but the true climax is man facing family he has wronged, admitting aloud the weight of his sins. That scene, quiet and devastating, is worth more than any explosion. It is the kind of moment literature revels in, where action collapses into morality, where plot bends into allegory. By the end, we are left not exhilarated but contemplative. The story has been thrilling, yes, but it has also been sobering. It reminds us that violence echoes beyond its moment, that identity cannot be erased, that redemption, if it exists, must be earned through truth. The second half closes the loop not with triumph, but with gravity, and in that gravity, it secures its place not only as thriller, but as text worthy of analysis, discussion, and remembrance. Characters here are not merely players on a stage of espionage. They're fractured mirrors reflecting guilt, survival, ambition, and grief. To study them is to realize that this story's true terrain is not Europe or Moscow, but the human soul, riddled with contradictions and shadows. At the center stands the man himself, no longer the disoriented amnesiac of the first tale, but someone carrying fragments of self like shards of glass. He is haunted, sharper now, aware of his skills, but crushed by the knowledge that those skills exist because he was broken into weapon. In every glance we see a paradox, efficiency forged by trauma, gentleness shadowed by violence. He is not the heroic archetype of most thrillers, but a character in constant negotiation with his past. Watching him is unsettling because we recognize something universal: our own regrets, our own memories we would rather bury, our own moments when survival demanded compromise. He is compelling precisely because he is both myth and man, assassin and penitent. The woman who anchors the beginning of his journey is not with us long, and yet her absence saturates the narrative. Her presence in the opening is soft rebellion against his past, her laughter and warmth reminders that he might have been something else, someone else. When she is taken from him, the film does not simply remove a character, it removes possibility. She becomes symbol of peace denied, of redemption delayed, of the ordinary life he cannot inhabit. Her ghost lingers, shaping his decisions, deepening his sorrow. She is less character than compass, pointing to what he might have been if history had allowed. The antagonist here is less a single figure and more the machinery of power, embodied in agency officials who scramble to cover lies and pin blame. Among them, one stands out, a director hardened by years of politics and paranoia. She does not foam with villainy. Her menace is quieter, bureaucratic, chilling in its pragmatism. She represents institution itself, the facelessness of systems that grind individuals into tools. Opposite the protagonist's humanity, she is ruthless efficiency, committed not to truth but to survival of structure. Her character reminds us that institutions are not neutral. They're driven by people who choose expedience over conscience. Another figure emerges from shadows, the assassin sent to eliminate him, a mirror of who he once was. Cold, precise, remorseless, this killer embodies the path he might have taken had amnesia not cracked him open. Their encounters are not just battles of fists and guns. They're confrontations with self, with the terrifying possibility that he is no different from the man hunting him. Symbolically, the assassin is his double, the ghost of identity he struggles to escape. There is also the family of the murdered Russian politician, whose presence transforms narrative into morality play. The widow's grief, her bitterness, her refusal to flinch when he admits his crime. She represents accountability. She does not forgive, nor does she explode with melodrama. She simply exists as a reminder that every bullet has consequence, every mission leaves scar. Her daughter, silent and fragile, magnifies this truth. Violence reverberates through generations. These characters, though minor in screen time, are monumental in meaning. They force the protagonist to see himself not as pawn or victim, but as perpetrator. The intelligence analysts and field agents swirling around the core characters function almost like a Greek chorus. They argue in conference rooms, whisper over phones, chase through cities. Their perspectives remind us that while the protagonist struggles for identity, the machinery sees him only as problem. Their presence sharpens contrast. One man's search for truth against institutions' obsession with control. They are less individuals than extensions of bureaucracy, faceless yet dangerous. Moscow itself becomes character. Its snow-laden streets, its gray apartments, its silence heavy with history, all conspire to confront him. Cities in this story are not neutral settings, but embodiments of psyche. Berlin is fractured, bureaucratic, suspicious. Naples is labyrinthine, opportunistic. Moscow is frozen, suffocating, demanding reckoning. Each city reflects inner state of protagonist. Each street corner another turn and maze of memory. Symbolically, the characters divide along axes of humanity and institution, guilt and denial. The protagonist embodies fractured humanity, guilty yet yearning. The widow embodies grief, transmuted into accusation. The assassin embodies denial, remorselessness, the past unexamined. The agency officials embody faceless structure, truth buried under survival. Together, they form chorus of contradiction, each voice echoing different response to guilt. What fascinates me most is how relationships between characters define meaning. The protagonist and his lost companion represent possibility denied. The protagonist and the assassin represent self-divided. The protagonist and the widow represent guilt confronted. The protagonist and the agency represent man against institution. These dynamics transform action into allegory, ensuring that every chase, every confrontation, every confession carries weight beyond plot. In conclusion, the characters here are not mere archetypes. They are embodiments of themes. They remind us that identity is fragile, that institutions crush conscience, that violence leaves echoes, that guilt demands acknowledgement. They are literature disguised as thriller, allegory disguised as chase. And that is why they linger long after the credits fade, not as spies and killers, but as mirrors held up to our own fractured humanity.